The shovel struck something that didn't belong. Luke Tanner had been digging the same patch of earth behind his cabin for 3 days, 8 feet down in a soil that was supposed to be solid, when the blade hit wood instead of dirt. The hollow thud stopped him cold. He wiped the sweat from his forehead, staring into the pit as a carved wooden step emerged from the packed earth. Another step followed beneath it, disappearing into shadows too deep to be natural. Luke had owned this land for 12 years, inherited from his father, who had worked it long before him. Nobody had ever mentioned stairs buried under the barren pasture. He crouched low, running his calloused fingers along the smooth oak surface. These weren't the remains of an old root cellar. They were new, built with purpose. The voices started on the 4th swing of his shovel, faint at first, like wind whispering through a crack. Luke froze, gripping the handle until his knuckles went white. The sound drifted up from the dark opening, human voices speaking words he couldn't quite make out. A woman, urgent and trembling. Then a man, low and angry. He dropped to his knees and pressed an ear to the hole. The voices grew clearer, echoing up a tunnel below. Someone was crying. Someone else was shouting in clipped sentences. These weren't distant travelers or neighbors passing on the old cattle trail 2 miles east. These voices came from directly beneath his feet, from a place no map said existed. A memory surfaced, tightening Luke's chest. 6 months ago, he'd seen wagon tracks crossing his eastern boundary at night. Fresh ruts too wide for his own cart, leading toward this very field before vanishing on hard ground. He dismissed them as rustlers cutting across his land. The woman's voice rose to a scream, then cut off. In the silence, Luke heard the scrape of metal on metal, the sound of a heavy door slamming shut. His heartbeat thudded in his ears. This wasn't an abandoned shelter. Someone had built this place for a reason, and that reason was still in use. He brushed dirt from his knees and thought about riding 20 miles to town for help. Sheriff Mason in Dry Creek wasn't a man who cared much for poor ranchers, but he'd have to listen to this. Still, another day would pass before anyone came back with ropes and lanterns. Could people trapped underground survive that long without food or water? Luke circled the hole, studying the stairs. They were solid oak, clean and unweathered. Whoever built them had done so within months, maybe weeks. He knelt and called down. "Hello? Can you hear me?" Silence stretched, then light footsteps echoed below. A woman's voice rose, clearer now. "Thank God someone found us. Please, you have to get us out. There are 6 of us down here. We don't have much time." "Who are you?" Luke asked. "How'd you get down there?" "My name's Grace Whitfield. We were traveling the northern trail when men attacked our wagons. They brought us here, said they'd keep us until," her voice cracked, "until someone pays to get us back." Luke felt the ground tilt beneath him. Kidnappers. They'd built a prison on his land. The tracks he'd seen weren't rustlers. They were hauling victims to this hidden place. "How many men?" Luke asked quickly. 3. They bring food and water every few days. They came yesterday morning, so they might. The distant drumming of hooves cut her off. Riders approaching fast from the east. Luke's heart slammed. If these were the same men, they'd kill him without hesitation to keep this secret buried. "Get away from the opening," he whispered. "Hide if you can. Men are coming." Luke grabbed his shovel and started throwing dirt back in, trying to cover the stairs. But the hoofbeats grew louder. There was too much loose soil to hide. They'd see everything. He scrambled for the boulders 30 yards north of the hole and dove behind the largest just as 3 riders crested the low hill. The leader was tall and lean, his black hat low over his face. Even at a distance, Luke could see the purposeful way they rode. These weren't lost travelers. The leader dismounted, cursing as he inspected the disturbed earth. "Someone's been digging here, Cole," he said to the younger man beside him. The name carried like a gunshot. Luke had heard it whispered in saloons. "Cole Barrett, bandit, kidnapper, killer." "Check the cabin," Barrett ordered. "Find whoever did this. Quietly. We can't afford witnesses." The 2 younger men rode off toward Luke's home while Barrett studied the stairs, calling into the darkness. "Everything all right down there? Anybody try to contact you?" "No." Grace's voice lied smoothly. "We heard digging, but no voices." Luke held his breath. Grace was protecting him. But it meant the prisoners were now part of his fight, in an even greater danger. Luke pressed his back against the sun-warmed boulder, forcing himself to breathe slow and quiet. From here, he could see both the pit and the riders approaching his cabin. The leader, Barrett, knelt by the hole, running calloused fingers through the fresh soil. His movements were steady, professional, like a man who'd done this before and cleaned up worse. "Someone was here this morning," one of the younger men called out. His voice carried clearly across the open ground. "Shovel marks are fresh." Luke's gut tightened. They were sharp, careful men, not drifters looking for easy trouble. "Check the cabin," Barrett said flatly, not even looking up. "Find who did this. No noise, no tracks. You know the drill." The two riders peeled off toward Luke's small home. Luke imagined them kicking his door open, finding his coffee still warm on the stove, his boots by the hearth. They'd know instantly that whoever dug that hole was still close by. Barrett cupped his hands to the dark opening. "Everything good down there?" he called. "Anybody bother you?" "No one came near us," Grace answered. Her voice was steady but thin. Luke could almost feel how hard she was forcing the calm. "We heard digging, that's all." Luke closed his eyes. She was lying to save him, gambling on a man she'd never met. He felt a rush of respect mixed with guilt. Barrett circled the pit slowly, eyes scanning the disturbed ground. "Whoever was here left in a hurry," he muttered. "Shovels still lying right there." A crack of splintering wood echoed from Luke's cabin. They'd forced the door. He pictured them moving through his home, rifles ready, boots scuffing on the floorboards where his father once sat telling stories by firelight. This land was all Luke had left of his family, and now it was being trampled by men who'd build prisons in the dirt. The younger men emerged from the cabin and called out. Nobody inside, but the fire's still warm. "Someone was here an hour ago, maybe less." Barrett drew a long knife from his belt and scraped dirt from under his fingernails as if he had all the time in the world. "Spread out," he said. "Search every inch of this place. Check the barn. Check behind every rock." His cold eyes scanned the pasture and settled directly on the boulder field. "Whoever's watching us, we'll find him." Luke's mouth went dry. They'd sweep the ground carefully, and the nearest rider would reach his hiding place within minutes. His rifle hung useless on the wall of his cabin, 200 yards away. His only weapon was the skinning knife on his belt, not much against three men with guns. From the pit behind Barrett, Luke heard faint voices. Grace speaking to someone, maybe calming the child he'd heard cry earlier. That sound hit him like a hammer to the chest. A sick child, trapped underground in darkness and filth. It dragged up memories Luke kept buried, his wife and son dying of fever 5 years ago while he was away buying cattle. He hadn't been there when they needed him most. The wind shifted, carrying the smell of dust and horses. The man searching near the barn was already out of sight, moving inside to check the stalls. If Luke could reach that barn without being seen, maybe he could even the odds. The searcher closest to him turned his back to inspect a patch of sagebrush. Luke moved, low and fast across the hard ground. His boots barely whispered against the dirt. Years of tracking cattle had taught him to walk like a ghost. He slipped around to the back of the barn, where the old door hung crooked on its hinges. Inside, a young voice spoke softly to Luke's horses. "Easy now. Just checking to see if your owner's hiding in here." The man couldn't have been more than 20. Luke pictured his own boy at that age, a thought that made his stomach twist. The kid turned his back, examining the feed bins. Luke acted on instinct. One hand clamped over the boy's mouth. The other drove the blade in quick and deep. The body went limp with a quiet sigh, never even a struggle. Luke caught him before he hit the ground, lowering him gently behind a stack of hay bales. For a moment, Luke just stared down at him, sandy hair, soft features, and felt something close to shame. This was somebody's son. But if Luke didn't do it, 6 innocent people would die in that hole. He slipped the revolver from the dead man's belt, tucking it into his own waistband. The odds had shifted. 2 against 1. Still bad, but maybe survivable. Through a crack in the barn wall, Luke saw Barrett still studying the hole, poking the dirt with a stick. The second searcher was methodically working toward the boulder field, calling out every few minutes. "Hey, Danny, you find anything?" Silence. Danny would never answer again. Luke's jaw tightened. When they realized one of their own was missing, this quiet search would turn into a hunt. Luke crouched in the barn loft, watching through the cracks in the floor as dust floated in thin shafts of sunlight. Danny's body lay hidden behind the hay bales, but Luke knew it wouldn't stay secret for long. These men weren't stupid. They'd figure out soon enough that someone was fighting back. Charlie, the remaining searcher's voice rang out across the pasture. Where the hell are you? Barrett straightened by the pit, his face unreadable under the brim of his hat. What's wrong? No answer, the man called back. He was at the barn 10 minutes ago. The moment of discovery was coming fast. Once they realized Danny was dead, Luke would lose his advantage. They'd be ready to kill, and careful not to give him an opening. Barrett drew his pistol and walked toward the barn while the other man closed in from the opposite side. Their movements were steady, practiced, covering each other's blind spots. These weren't desperate drifters, they were professionals. If someone killed Danny, they're still in there, Barrett said sharply. Don't get sloppy, Tommy. Whoever did this is quiet and fast. Luke gripped the revolver he'd taken from Danny. His breathing slowed. He had to think, not panic. If he ran for the tree line 2 miles west, they'd gun him down in the open before he got halfway. If he stayed hidden, they'd set the barn on fire and flush him out. The ladder to the loft creaked softly as he shifted his weight. He edged toward the hay door above the entrance, planning an ambush. If Tommy walked inside first, Luke could take him down fast, evening the fight to 1 against 1. From his perch, Luke could hear every sound. Boots crunching on gravel, the faint nervous snort of his horses, the dry whisper of the wind against the barn walls. He stayed still as Tommy stepped across the threshold, gun drawn, scanning the stalls. Charlie, Tommy's voice held a tremor now. You in here, partner? 3 more steps, and Luke would have a clean shot. But before Tommy moved deeper, Barrett's voice cut through the air outside. Found him. Luke's blood went cold. Through a gap in the wall, he saw Barrett standing over a faint bloodstain near the barn door, a trail from where Luke had dragged Danny's body. Tommy, out here. Now, Barrett barked. Our friend dragged him inside. This ain't some dumb ranch hand. He knows what he's doing. Tommy backed toward the door, eyes darting, finger tied on the trigger. Luke stayed frozen above, barely breathing. He couldn't risk a shot now. Both men were in position, alert, ready to fire at any movement. What's the plan, boss? Tommy asked, voice tight. Burn it down, Barrett said calmly. Either he comes out or he dies in the fire. Either way, we finish it. Luke watched through the loft slats as Barrett started gathering dry grass and brush against the barn wall. The wind carried the smell of smoke already. From the hole in the pasture came the faint voices of the prisoners, growing louder, alarmed. A child whimpered, muffled as if someone pressed a hand over her mouth to keep her quiet. The thought of that little girl, feverish, trapped underground, hit Luke like a blow. He'd failed to save his own child. He wouldn't fail again, not while he could still fight. Barrett struck a match. The small flame hissed to life, bright in the dry morning air. Luke didn't hesitate. He dropped through the loft opening, hitting the barn floor hard enough to knock the breath from his lungs. Rolling to his feet, he sprinted for the back door just as Tommy shouted and fired. Bullets tore through wood behind him, splintering the frame as he dove into the open sunlight. He's running for the rocks. Tommy yelled. Head him off at the creek, Barrett ordered. But Luke wasn't running for the creek. He darted behind a low stone wall that marked the edge of his pasture, then doubled back parallel to the barn. Barrett's eyes stayed fixed on the rocks, expecting him to appear there. Tommy took the bait and sprinted off to cut him off. That left Barrett alone by the pit. Luke steadied the revolver across the top of the wall, taking careful aim. He'd put down wounded cattle from farther than this. One squeeze of the trigger, and the gun kicked in his hand. Barrett spun sideways, clutching his right shoulder, his pistol falling into the dirt. Not a killing shot, but enough to drop his gun arm. Luke vaulted over the wall and charged. Barrett was crawling for his weapon when a sharp kick sent it skittering out of reach. Luke pressed the revolver against Barrett's neck. Call your man off, Luke growled. Now! Barrett's lips curled in a bloody smile. You think this ends with me? I've got people. Kill me, and you'll never see them coming. Maybe, but you won't be around to watch. Boss, Tommy shouted from the rocks. Barrett tried to speak, but Luke shoved the barrel harder into his throat. Call him off, or I end you right here. From the pit, Grace's voice rose again, desperate. Please, whatever you're doing, hurry. There's a child down here who won't last a day. The urgency decided everything. Luke had no time for long debates. He raised his voice, eyes never leaving Barrett. Tommy, he shouted, your boss is bleeding out. Drop your gun and walk away, or he dies where he sits. Seconds stretched like hours. Tommy's figure appeared from behind the rocks, gun in hand, eyes wide as he saw Barrett on the ground. Do it, Luke barked. Drop it now. Tommy stood frozen, his revolver shaking slightly in his hand. He was young, too young for a life like this. His eyes flicked between Luke and Barrett, and in that brief hesitation Luke saw something more than fear. It was doubt. Do it, Luke shouted again, pressing the barrel harder into Barrett's neck. Drop it or watch him die. Barrett's teeth clenched as blood soaked his shirt. Don't listen to him, kid, he snarled, voice raw with pain. Shoot him, right now. But Tommy's breathing came quick and shallow. Sweat dripped from his temple. He looked at Barrett, then back at Luke, and finally lowered his gun. I'm not dying for you, he muttered, his voice cracking. He tossed the revolver into the dirt and backed away slowly, hands raised. Boss has been good to me, but this ain't worth it. Smart choice, Luke said coldly. Get on your horse and ride. Don't come back. Tommy hesitated, searching Barrett's face for some sign of forgiveness or command. But Barrett only glared up at him, lips pressed tight, eyes full of venom. Tommy turned away, mounted up, and spurred his horse east, a thin line of dust trailing behind him until he disappeared over the rise. Luke kept his revolver steady as Barrett tried to shift upright. This don't end here. Rancher, Barrett hissed through clenched teeth. You got no idea who you're messing with. I've got partners. Big ones. Your partners don't matter where you're going, Luke said. He yanked a coil of rope from his saddle and bound Barrett's hands tightly behind his back, ignoring the outlaw's curses. The man tried to spit at him, but his strength was fading fast. Blood loss was sapping the fight right out of him. The voices from the pit rose again, urgent and frightened. Please, Grace called up. She's burning up. Luke's chest tightened as he ran to the hole. The wooden stairs disappeared 12 feet down into darkness that smelled of damp earth and something fouler, sweat, mildew, human misery. He descended carefully, the revolver still in his hand. The tunnel opened into a rough limestone chamber where 6 people sat, chained to iron rings hammered into the rock. They were filthy, pale, and hollow-eyed. Grace Whitfield looked exactly how her voice had sounded, determined but exhausted. Beside her lay a little girl on a pile of dirty blankets, her breathing shallow, her lips dry and cracked. The fever started 3 days ago, Grace said quickly as Luke searched for keys on Barrett's belt. She hasn't woken up since last night. Luke's hands worked fast, unlocking each chain. The prisoners moved stiffly, wincing as the iron came free. An elderly man groaned in relief. A teenage boy rubbed raw wrists, and a woman, probably the sick child's mother, clutched her daughter so tightly it looked like she was afraid someone would snatch her away again. Luke felt anger burn through him. These weren't just victims. They were families, people who'd been living a waking nightmare while he'd gone about feeding cattle and mending fences overhead. We have to move now, Luke said, helping the child's mother to her feet. There's a doctor in Dry Creek, 20 miles south. My wagon can carry you all. Grace looked at him, eyes steady even through the exhaustion. What about him? She nodded toward the stairs. Barrett, Luke said. He's coming with us. In ropes. Back in the daylight, Luke called the outlaw to his feet and shoved him toward the wagon. Barrett tried to resist, but his strength was gone. Luke threw him into the back like a sack of grain, then helped the others climb aboard. The sick child was frighteningly light in his arms. Luke could feel the heat of her fever through the thin blanket. By sunset, they were rolling across the prairie, the horses driven hard. Grace sat with the little girl in her lap, whispering prayers under her breath. The other prisoners spoke in quiet voices, planning what they'd do when they finally saw home again. Luke kept his eyes on the trail and his hand on the revolver, glancing back at Barrett slumped against the wagon side, still conscious, still glaring like a cornered wolf. As the wheels rattled over the ruts, Luke felt something he hadn't felt in years: purpose. When his wife and son died, he'd buried more than just family. He'd buried his reason to care about anything but survival. But now, with 6 strangers depending on him, that old spark came back to life. Sheriff Mason would have questions. There would be trouble about the dead man in Luke's barn. There'd be investigations, maybe even a trial. But none of that mattered right now. The only thing that mattered was the weak pulse of the child lying in Grace's arms, and the knowledge that Luke still had time to save her. Barrett groaned from the back of the wagon, his voice hoarse. "You're a dead man, Tanner. You hear me? Dead." Luke glanced over his shoulder, his eyes hard. "Get some rest, Barrett. You're going to need your strength to stand trial." The wagon rolled on into the deepening dusk, its wheels grinding over the dry earth, carrying its cargo of wounded strangers, one bitter outlaw, and a man who had finally remembered what it felt like to fight for more than himself. The night air was cold on the open prairie. Luke kept the wagon moving fast, glancing back often at the people huddled in the bed. The little girl lay in Grace's lap, wrapped in a blanket. Her skin looked pale, her breathing weak. Grace whispered to her softly, rocking her as if that alone could keep her alive. Luke's shoulders ached from hours of driving. His throat was dry, his mind racing. Every bump in the trail made the wagon rattle and shake. He feared the motion might hurt the sick child, but stopping wasn't an option. Dry Creek was still many miles away. Barrett sat tied in the corner of the wagon bed, blood dark on his shirt. Even wounded, his eyes stayed sharp. He didn't look scared. He looked angry, like a man who was already planning his revenge. "You're making a mistake, Tanner," Barrett said after an hour of silence. "You think you're a hero. You're not. My partners won't let this slide." Luke didn't answer. He didn't even look back. "You kill one of my boys," Barrett went on, voice low and mean, "and take me prisoner, you're signing your death warrant. Folks will come looking. You'll never see him coming." Luke's jaw tightened, but his voice stayed calm. "You should save your breath. You're going to need it to explain yourself to the sheriff." Barrett gave a short laugh that turned into a cough. "Sheriff Mason? That man's been taking bribes from us for years. You think he'll help you?" Grace looked up sharply from the back of the wagon. "Is that true?" she asked, her voice tight with fear. Luke's hands gripped the reins harder. "Maybe Mason's crooked. Maybe not. Either way, you and these people need a doctor. That comes first." The other prisoners were quiet, listening to every word. The teenage boy stared at Barrett with pure hatred. The 2 older men whispered together, probably worried what would happen when they reached town. The woman holding her daughter didn't look at anyone. Her eyes stayed on the child's face like she was afraid to blink. The moon was high when Luke finally slowed the team near a creek to water the horses. Grace climbed down carefully, still holding the child. Luke helped the others out, stretching their stiff legs. He knelt by the creek, scooped water into his hat, and gave it to them to drink. The little girl didn't wake. Grace dipped a rag in the cool water and pressed it to her forehead. "She's burning up," Grace said quietly. "If we don't get her medicine soon," she didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Luke nodded grimly. "We'll make it," he said, as much to himself as to her. When they climbed back onto the wagon, Barrett spoke again. "You think you're saving these people," he said. "But you're not. My boys will follow. Even if I hang, someone else will come. We've been doing this a long time." Luke turned in his seat and met Barrett's eyes. "Not on my land," he said simply. "Never again." The rest of the night passed in tense silence. Luke drove until his back screamed and his fingers went numb around the reins. He didn't dare stop, not even when the horses started to tire. He pushed them on, talking to them under his breath, promising they'd rest soon. Just before dawn, the lights of Dry Creek appeared on the horizon, small and flickering but real. Luke felt a wave of relief, so strong it almost brought tears to his eyes. He shook it off and urged the horses faster. As the wagon rolled into town, a dog barked somewhere in the distance. A door opened on the main street. An old man stepped out, staring in surprise. Luke drove straight to the doctor's house, hammering on the door with his fist until the sleepy physician appeared in his nightshirt. "Girl's burning with fever," Luke said quickly. "Needs medicine right now." The doctor didn't ask questions. He took one look at the child and waved them inside. Grace carried her in while the others followed. Luke stayed behind, tying Barrett to the wagon so he couldn't slip away. "Where's Sheriff Mason?" Luke asked the doctor as he passed. "Across the street," the man said without looking up. "He won't be happy to see you banging on doors at this hour." Luke gave a hard smile. He's about to be a lot less happy. Luke waited outside the doctor's house, keeping one eye on Barrett tied to the wagon wheel. The outlaw sat slumped but awake, his glare never leaving Luke. Inside, muffled voices rose and fell, the doctor working fast, Grace and the others trying to help. A child whimpered once, then went quiet. Luke hated that sound. The eastern sky was turning gray when Sheriff Mason finally appeared. He was a broad man with tired eyes, his badge dull with age. He walked across the street in no hurry, boots crunching on the packed dirt. "What's all this, Tanner?" Mason called, raising half the town before sunrise. Luke didn't waste words. He pointed to the wagon. "That man's Cole Barrett. He and 2 others built a prison on my land. 6 people were locked underground for weeks. One of them's a child. She's inside fighting for her life. One of his men is dead. The other ran off." Mason's eyes flicked to Barrett, who gave a bloody grin. "Morning, Sheriff," Barrett drawled. "This rancher's got himself in a heap of trouble." Mason sighed, as though this were just another ranch dispute. "Luke," he said, "you can't go killing men on your own. That's for the law to decide." Luke stepped closer, his voice low and steady. "Then do your job. Put him in a cell. Right now." Grace came out of the doctor's house, her face pale but hopeful. "The fever's breaking," she said softly. "He thinks she'll pull through if we keep her cool and get her real food." Her eyes hardened when they fell on Mason. "Are you really going to stand there and argue about rules while this man walks free?" The sheriff rubbed his jaw, uncomfortable. "Barrett's got friends," he muttered. "If I arrest him, they'll ride into town looking for trouble." "Let them come," Luke said. "But you're not turning him loose." The 2 men locked eyes. Mason saw something in Luke's face, something that told him this rancher wouldn't back down. Not this time. With a heavy sigh, Mason pulled out his cuffs. "Fine, I'll take him. But if his people show up, it's on you." Luke untied Barrett, keeping the revolver pressed to his ribs. Barrett chuckled under his breath. "You think his cell's gonna hold me? You're dumber than you look." Mason led the outlaw toward the small brick jail at the end of the street. A few townsfolk had gathered now, whispering as they watched. Grace stood beside Luke, her shoulders straight even though exhaustion lined her face. "You risked your life for strangers," she said quietly. "Why?" Luke looked at her for a long moment. 5 years ago, my wife and son died while I was away buying cattle. I wasn't there when they needed me. I'm not letting that happen again. Not to anybody." Grace didn't speak, but her eyes softened. When Mason came back, he tried to sound casual. "He's locked up for now. I wired over to the county judge. They'll send deputies to take him to the capital for trial." "You really think they'll make it that far?" Luke asked. Mason didn't answer. The doctor stepped outside then, wiping his hands. "The little one's resting. Fever's down some. She'll need days of care, but she's past the worst of it if we keep watch." Relief hit Luke so hard he had to look away. He busied himself unhitching the team, pretending not to feel the sting behind his eyes. But deep down, he knew Barrett wasn't done. Men like him didn't just disappear into a cell. They had friends with long memories and longer guns. And now those friends would know Luke Tanner's name. The morning sun rose slow and pale over Dry Creek, casting long shadows on the street. Luke leaned against the wagon, arms crossed, staring at the jail where Barrett sat behind iron bars. A crowd had gathered despite the early hour, townsfolk whispering, curious faces peeking from doorways. Word traveled fast out here, and the name Cole Barrett carried weight. Inside the doctor's house, the little girl slept on a clean bed, her breathing steady now. Grace refused to leave her side. The other prisoners, still shaken and weak, sat around the kitchen table drinking coffee as though they had just come home from a funeral. They'd been chained underground for weeks, and now they didn't know whether to cry, laugh, or collapse. Luke tried to keep his thoughts on them, but his eyes kept drifting back to the jail. He didn't trust Mason. The sheriff hadn't said much after locking Barrett up. Luke could still hear the man's warning. His people will come. And when they do, you're on your own. Around noon, Luke finally stepped into the doctor's house. The smell of boiled herbs filled the air. Grace looked up from the child's bedside, her hair messy, her face lined with exhaustion, but she still managed a small smile. "She's resting easier," she whispered. Luke nodded. "That's good news." He poured himself a cup of coffee, sat at the table, and looked at the other freed captives. "What are your plans when you're strong enough to travel?" An older man cleared his throat. "Head east. Get back to family. Tell him we're alive." His voice cracked at the last word. The teenage boy, silent all morning, stared at the table, twisting his hands. Luke saw his own son in that nervous gesture and had to look away. A hard rap on the door broke the moment. Mason stepped inside, removing his hat. His face was grim. "We got trouble," he said. Luke stood at once. "How many?" "2 riders, maybe 3, Mason replied, coming fast from the west. "They're Barrett's men, no doubt about it." Grace's eyes flashed with fear. "We're not safe here." "Safer than you were in that hole," Luke said, though he felt no comfort in his own words. He looked at Mason. "You got enough deputies to hold them off?" Mason gave a bitter laugh. "Deputies? I barely got myself. Folks around here don't stick their necks out for free." Luke glanced toward the window, saw dust rising on the horizon. "Then we'd better get ready." They moved fast. Luke checked the revolver he'd taken from Danny, loading fresh rounds with steady hands. Mason fetched his shotgun. Grace helped the prisoners gather in the doctor's cellar, out of sight in case bullets started flying. When the riders appeared, Luke recognized the look in their eyes, even from a distance. Cold, deliberate men who weren't here to talk. They stopped in the street, horses stomping nervously, and called out loud enough for the whole town to hear. "Turn him loose," one of them shouted. "Barrett walks free, and no one gets hurt." Luke stepped onto the boardwalk, his revolver at his side. "Not gonna happen," he called back. "Ride out while you still can." The man spat in the dirt. "Wrong answer." The first shot rang out, shattering the quiet afternoon. Luke dove behind a water trough as splinters flew. Mason returned fire from the jail doorway, buckshot spraying the street. The townsfolk scattered, doors slamming, windows snapping shut. Luke felt the old fear rise in his chest. The same fear he'd felt 5 years ago when sickness took his family and there was nothing he could do. But this time he could do something. He'd chosen this fight. Bullets cracked overhead. Luke leaned out and fired once, driving one rider back behind his horse. The other circled wide, trying to flank Mason. "Mason!" Luke yelled. "Left side!" The sheriff swung his shotgun and fired. The second rider toppled from his saddle, clutching his leg, screaming. The last man hesitated, then turned his horse hard and galloped out of town, kicking up dust as he went. Luke rose from cover, chest heaving, scanning the street. The fight had lasted less than a minute, but it felt like an hour. Mason approached the wounded man, kicked his gun away, and looked at Luke. "This isn't over," he muttered. "No," Luke agreed, holstering his revolver. "But it's a start." Inside the doctor's house, Grace hugged him suddenly, surprising them both. Her arms were trembling. "Thank you," she whispered. "You didn't have to stay. You could have walked away." Luke shook his head, his voice quiet. "I already walked away once in my life. Not again." The street in Dry Creek stayed quiet after the gunfire. The wounded rider was dragged into the jail, swearing under his breath. The other had ridden off hard, and Luke knew it wouldn't be the last they'd see of Barrett's kind. Men like that didn't forgive. But for now, the town was safe, and Barrett was locked behind iron bars, nursing a shoulder wound that would remind him of Luke Tanner every time it rained. The doctor came outside later that afternoon. His hands were stained with medicine, his face lined with fatigue. "She's awake," he said with a tired smile. "Weak but awake." She asked for her mother. Luke felt something loosen inside his chest, something tight that had been there for years. Grace stood in the doorway, her eyes shining as she motioned Luke inside. The little girl lay propped on pillows, sipping water while her mother held her close. The others crowded around her, smiling through tears. They looked like people who had been dragged back from the edge of death. Luke stayed near the door, hat in hand, feeling strangely out of place. Grace crossed him. "You saved her," she said softly. Luke shook his head. "The doctor did." "You did, keeping her alive down there. But you gave us a chance," Grace said. "No one else would have come looking. You didn't even know us." Luke glanced at the child, breathing easier now, then looked away. "5 years ago," he said quietly, "I wasn't there when my own family needed me. I can't fix that, but I wasn't about to let it happen again." Grace put a hand on his arm, her voice steady. "You did more than help us. You reminded us there are still good men out here." Outside, Sheriff Mason joined them. "Deputies are on the way," he said, sounding more serious than before. "They'll take Barrett to the Capitol. I don't like it, but I think you were right, Tanner. If we let him go, there'd be more bodies in the ground." Luke gave a short nod. "Make sure he makes it there alive. If he escapes, I'll come looking again." Mason studied him for a long moment and finally said, "You're a stubborn man." "Maybe," Luke said, "but stubborn's what kept 6 people breathing." That evening, the prisoners shared a simple meal at the doctor's table. The teenage boy even managed to laugh when Luke told a story about his first days trying to run cattle alone. For a while, the room felt warm, alive, like a family gathering instead of a rescue after a nightmare. When the sun set, Luke hitched his wagon again. He planned to take the freed captives to the next stage stop on their way east. Grace walked with him to the horses. "You could come with us," she said. "Start over somewhere new. You don't owe this land anything." Luke smiled faintly, shaking his head. "This land's all I got left of my folks. I'm not running from it." He tightened the reins. "Besides, men like Barrett need to know somebody's still willing to stand their ground." Grace looked at him with a kind of respect that didn't need words. "Thank you," she said simply. As the wagon rolled out of town the next morning, Luke felt a strange peace settle over him. He hadn't brought his wife and son back. He never would. But he'd saved 6 strangers, and in doing so, found a piece of himself he thought was gone forever. The prairie stretched wide and quiet around him, the sky glowing gold with dawn. Life out here was harsh and lonely, but it still held moments where a man could choose to do right, no matter the cost. Luke Tanner had learned something in the dirt and blood of his own land. You can't change the past, but you can decide who you are now. Sometimes courage isn't about fighting to live. It's about fighting so someone else can. The story ends with a moral lesson. No man can rewrite his yesterdays, but he can stand up for someone else's tomorrow. Doing the right thing, even when no one's watching, gives life its meaning.